Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a discovery of a new record holder, the discovery of the largest genome in any organism out there. The genome that contains an enormous amount of base pairs, and so let's discuss this in a little bit more detail, but I guess first, let me show you a picture of what this organism is, and it's right here. Not very impressive, right? But before I explain to you what we're looking at, let's talk about biology first. And I guess here let's start with humans. Human body contains approximately 30 trillion cells on average, and each of those cells contains a nucleus inside of which we find DNA. And in terms of size and number of base pairs, for all of the humans the genome is pretty much the same. It contains about 3.1 billion base pairs. And though today we still don't actually know what most of this genetic material does to our body, we know that it's able to produce approximately 20,000 genes that then forms the proteins that make us who we are. But apart from our own cells, our body, inside and outside, also contains a lot of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and even archaea. And in terms of sheer numbers, it's actually more than 30 trillion. And each of them contains their own genome as well. And it actually varies dramatically in size and in complexity. For example, for a typical virus, especially for various bacteriophages, many of which live inside of us, their genome is only about 3,500 base pairs large. That's roughly around 800,000 times smaller than the human genome. Although some viral DNA can actually be large, up to 1,000 times bigger. And though most of these viruses don't live inside of us, some can be found depending on certain situations. Likewise, when it comes to bacteria, some bacteria have very small genome that's only about 120,000 base pairs large, or about 30,000 times smaller than human genome, with a typical bacterial genome being in millions of base pairs. One of the largest one is approximately 13 million, and that's only 200 times smaller than human genome. But it gets even more complex once we reach more advanced animals, and especially once we reach plants. So, for example, when it comes to animals, things get complicated really quick. Size here really doesn't matter. So even though genome of humans is 3.1 billion base pairs, and for a lot of birds it's 1 billion, we know that this little creature, Antarctic krill, one of the most successful and most abundant animal species on the planet, at least in terms of biomass, contains an enormous genome even compared to humans. Here it's about 48 billion base pairs, or about 16 times as large as what we have. But this amphibian has even more. This is known as the Neuse River water dog, usually found in North Carolina, and back in 2022 it was discovered that their genome is one of the largest out there. But it's mostly just a lot of repeats, or a lot of what's known as junk DNA. Here it's about 118 billion base pairs, or 40 times as large as human genome. But as you might have learned from one of the previous videos, the largest genome is right here, the unusual fish known as the lungfish. It contains 130 billion base pairs, so just a little bit larger than the amphibian I showed you, and at this point it makes things really confusing, because here the size really doesn't actually define complexity, and it's very difficult to explain why a certain genome is so large. And it actually shows us that the total DNA content seems to vary dramatically between different animals. But of all life on the planet, it's really plants that seem to have the most complexity and the most diversity when it comes to their genome. For example, here we have a plant known as Genome aurea, whose genome is about 60 million base pairs in total. That's basically the smallest for any plant. In comparison, Paris japonica, also known as Kinugasa japonica, was actually the previous record holder for the largest genome ever found. This was about 150 billion base pairs, or 2,500 times bigger than that previous plant. And even though the discovery of this genome was already really confusing, with a lot of biologists thinking that maybe we actually reached the limit of how big genomes can get, everyone became really surprised when they discovered this new record holder. This is actually found on only one island in New Caledonia in the Pacific Ocean, and it's a tiny fern known as Tmesipteris oblanceolata, containing 160 billion base pairs, so just a little bit bigger than all of the previous record holders, but also about 50 times larger than what humans have. And here once again, the size and the complexity basically doesn't really make sense. This particular plant is really small, it's only about 5 to 10 centimeters tall, but every cell inside of this plant contains an enormous nucleus with a large amount of genetic material. And here, if you were to basically somehow unwrap the DNA from this fern, turning it into one long string of molecules, it would actually be over 100 meters or 300 feet in length. But why it's so big and why it's so long, nobody currently knows. But the thing is, for plants, having this large genome can also be a bit of a disadvantage. Mostly because larger genome means larger cells. Because you need to somehow fit all of this material inside the nucleus. And that could also mean that the plant will grow much slower, because a lot of individual structures have to be much larger on average. And even copying the DNA in this case would be a lot trickier just because of the size. It would obviously take much longer, and would have to have a lot of backup mechanisms in order to prevent any potential errors. Which of course implies that some of these largest genomes, at least for plants, would very likely be found in plants that are much slower growing, and so very likely in plants that cannot actually be affected by things like weather or seasons. Mostly because it's assumed that a lot of these plants would not be able to adapt to various changes as quickly as some other plants. But obviously all of these right now are just assumptions. And mostly assumptions based on where we usually find these plants with enormous genomes compared to plants that have genomes that are much smaller. Because the reality is that we have no idea why the genome is so big and what most of this genetic material does inside the cells. And though previously this genetic material was referred to as junk DNA, today we actually understand that even junk DNA has certain function. We just don't always know what that function is. Although in this case, the mystery is really why and how do genomes become so big or so small, and what sort of evolutionary pressure causes them to increase or decrease their size. But in general, so far, the evidence does suggest that having a large genome might not be that beneficial for various types of organisms. As a matter of fact, in some cases, like in cases of so-called living fossils, it might even prevent effective evolution. You can learn more about this in one of the previous videos right there. But in other cases, the researchers have even been able to design specific cells by removing a lot of extra DNA and leaving behind just the genes responsible for creating proteins. And these unusual synthetic cells are actually super exciting in trying to figure out how evolution works and why certain genomes are so ridiculously large. Another video in the description below explains that as well, with some really intriguing examples. But when it comes to this particular fern, well, right now this is really exciting, really unusual, but nobody knows why its genome is so large. It is a record holder, but that's really all we know. Once we discover something else, or once something else beats this record, which by the way is possible because so far we actually only have genome for approximately 20,000 different species on the planet, and that's out of millions out there, we'll definitely come back and talk more about this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon by joining channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.